I remember the morning the light never came. It was June of 1816, and I had risen before dawn like I always did. The rooster crowed, the cows shifted in their stalls. My wife, Sarah, stirred beside the hearth, stoking what little firewood we had left from spring. But the sky wasn't right. At first, I thought it was a storm rolling in from the west. We'd seen strange weather all year, frost in May, ice on the water trough when there should have been dew. But this felt different. The air carried a weight to it, thick, heavy, wrong. By sunup, the horizon should have glowed gold over our Vermont hills. Instead, it stayed gray. Not storm gray, ash gray. By mid-morning, it looked like dusk. The chickens went back to roost. The cows bawled nervously. Even the forest seemed quiet. No bird song, no insects humming, just a strange, muffled silence like the world was holding its breath. I stepped out into the field, boots sinking into soil that should have been warm and alive, but it was cold. In June. Cold enough that my breath fogged faintly before me. Neighbors gathered along the fence lines. No one spoke at first. We all just stared upward. The sun was there. We could see its shape faintly through the haze, but it looked like a dying ember behind dirty glass. Someone muttered, "It's the end times." No one argued. We had no word yet of Mount Tambora. No idea that a volcano half a world away in the Dutch East Indies had exploded the year before, louder than any sound mankind had recorded. We didn't know that ash and sulfur had climbed into the upper sky and were now circling the globe like a funeral shroud. All we knew was that summer had disappeared. By afternoon, flakes began to fall. Not snow exactly, but something like it. Fine dust. It coated our coats, our crops, the pond water. It settled into the leaves of our corn, weighing them down like sickness. I rubbed some between my fingers. It felt wrong. That night, frost came. In June, it crept across our fields like a thief. By morning, the bean vines were blackened. The corn leaves hung limp. The potato tops curled in on themselves as though they'd been burned. Sarah walked the rows in silence, her hands trembling. "Maybe it'll warm," she whispered. But it didn't. The cold stayed. Days passed in a dim twilight. The sky never cleared. Sunsets were blood red, deep and unnatural, like the heavens themselves were bruised. Churches filled. Preachers shouted about judgment. Old men claimed they'd never seen such darkness in all their years, and hunger began its slow approach. We tried replanting. The seeds froze in the ground. We tried covering the fields at night with cloth and straw. It didn't matter. July came with ice in the water buckets. August brought snow in higher elevations. Snow in August. The cattle grew thin first, then the chickens stopped laying. Milk soured faster than usual. Every meal felt smaller than the one before. Rumors spread faster than the frost. They said crops had failed across New York, across Pennsylvania, even down into Massachusetts. Some families began packing wagons, heading west, heading anywhere they believed the sky might still be blue. But we stayed. This was our land. My father had carved these fields from forest with his bare hands, and I wasn't about to surrender to a sky gone mad. Still, when I lay awake at night, listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls, I wondered the same thing as every other man in Vermont. What if the sun never came back? Because by late summer, it felt like something had broken in the world, and none of us knew how long we could survive without light.
By July's end, we stopped talking about summer. We spoke instead of survival.
The cold did not leave. It settled into the bones of the land like an illness that refused to break. Each morning I woke hoping for warmth, for one honest sunrise, but the sky remained dim, painted in that same sickly gray. The light never felt clean anymore. It filtered through the haze, weak and colorless, as though the sun had grown tired. Our corn was gone, blackened, dead. The beans had collapsed into themselves. Potatoes, the one crop that sometimes endured hardship, turned mushy beneath the soil. When I dug them up, they smelled of rot. And then the animals began to fail. The cows were first. We had 3, Bess, Martha, and a young heifer not yet named. By late July, their ribs were pressing hard against hide. There wasn't enough pasture left. The frost had burned the grass down to brittle straw. I tried cutting what little remained near the tree line, mixing it with dried weeds, anything green enough to resemble feed. It wasn't enough. Milk thinned, then it slowed to nearly nothing. One morning I stepped into the barn and found Bess on her side, breathing shallow. Her eyes rolled toward me when I knelt beside her. I spoke softly, the way I had since she was a calf. She didn't stand again. I buried her beyond the stone wall, where the soil was softest. The ground felt colder than it should have been for July. Sarah didn't cry. She just stared out at the fields while I shoveled. When livestock begins to die, a farmer feels something more than grief. It's fear. It's arithmetic. It's the quiet understanding that every animal lost is food gone, milk gone, trade gone, winter gone. Within weeks, neighbors were slaughtering early. Meat that should have fattened through autumn was being salted and hung in midsummer. Smoke rose from chimneys day and night as families preserved what little they had before the cold stole it too. The chickens stopped laying altogether. Egg baskets sat empty. The pond behind the house grew strange, its surface filmed with an odd sheen from the fallen ash. The fish floated near the top, sluggish. I caught 2 one afternoon. Their flesh was pale and tasted wrong, metallic somehow. We ate 'em anyway. Hunger has a way of lowering a man's standards. By August, the forest changed. Birds vanished first, then the insects. Even the crickets stopped their evening song. The silence grew unbearable. One night, a knock came at the door. It was Thomas Hale from the next ridge over. His face looked 10 years older than it had in spring. "They're leaving," he said. "Who?" "The Whitakers. Packed their wagon, heading toward Ohio. They heard it's warmer there." Ohio. The word sounded distant, like another world. "They say crops failed there too," I told him. He nodded. "They say a lot of things." We stood in silence, 2 men measuring the weight of decisions neither wanted to make. Leaving meant abandoning land carved from sweat and blood. Staying meant betting our lives on a sky that had already betrayed us. A week later, we slaughtered Martha. I held the knife steady. It was too soon. She should have seen at least 3 more winters, but I could see the truth in her frame. Better to choose the day than wait for nature to choose it for us. Sarah salted the meat carefully, nothing wasted. Even the bones were boiled for broth. The heifer followed days later. By September, our barn stood nearly empty. And with the animals gone, something else disappeared too. The rhythm of farm life. No milking at dawn, no feeding at dusk, no warm breath rising in the cold air. Just quiet, too much quiet. The sky turned darker in early September than I'd ever seen it. Not storm dark, but thick, like smoke that never cleared. Some days the sun glowed red enough to make you uneasy just looking at it. Churches stayed full. Men who'd never prayed now prayed loudly. Women whispered about revelation, and hunger sharpened tempers. At the trading post, flour prices doubled, then tripled.
I watched a man nearly come to blows over a sack of grain no larger than a pillow. We began rationing. Breakfast became a thin porridge of ground oats stretched with water. Supper, a small slice of salted meat, and whatever roots I could still dig from the stubborn earth. Sarah grew quieter. I could see her counting each bite before she swallowed. One evening she said softly, "If winter comes early," she didn't finish. She didn't have to. We both knew. Winter without animals, without crops, without trade. Winter under a sky that refused to heal. And yet, somewhere beneath the fear, I still believed, foolishly perhaps, that the world would right itself. Storms pass, seasons turn, the sun always rises. That's what I had believed my entire life. But as September frost returned, thicker, heavier, more cruel than before, I began to wonder whether we were witnessing something no man had prepared for. Not a bad season, not a hard year, but the breaking of the natural order itself. And if that was true, then slaughtered cows were only the beginning.
By October, hunger was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It had moved in with us. It sat at our table. It slept between Sarah and me at night. The first weeks of scarcity felt manageable. We told ourselves we were being careful, sensible, stretching what we had the way farmers always do when a season turns lean. But lean seasons still have hope. This one did not. The sky remained dim, stained with that strange veil that never lifted. Sunrises came weak and colorless. Sunsets bled red across the hills as though the heavens themselves were bruised. And the cold crept closer each day. Our salted beef hung from the rafters, but it was less than it looked. When I ran the numbers in my head, carefully, quietly, I knew it wouldn't carry us through a full winter. Not if it came early, not if it came hard. And everything about that year told me it would. We reduced meals again. Morning porridge became thinner, more water than grain. Supper was a sliver of meat shaved carefully with a knife, measured not by hunger, but by arithmetic. Sarah insisted I take the larger portion. "You work the fields," she would say. But there were no fields left to work. I saw her wrists growing narrow. I saw the way she stood too quickly sometimes and steadied herself against the table. One afternoon I walked to town, hoping for trade. The road looked different than it had in spring. Wagons rutted the mud deeper. Homes stood quiet where smoke once rose steady from chimneys. Some families had already left. Doors barred, windows boarded, livestock pens empty. At the trading post, the shelves were thin. Flour cost nearly 8 times what it had the year before. A man I knew, Samuel Briggs, argued loudly over a sack of cornmeal. "I've children," he said, his voice cracking. "You can't charge that." The storekeeper's face looked hollow. "I charge what I paid," he replied. Money had become almost meaningless. There simply wasn't food to buy. I traded a pocket watch, my father's, for 2 small sacks of rye. It felt like selling memory. When I returned home, Sarah smiled as if I'd brought treasure, and in a way I had. But hunger does not leave once fed. It only retreats. By late October, the forest changed again. I began hunting deeper into the woods, rising before dawn. Deer were scarce. The animals sensed something wrong too. I tracked one buck for nearly half a day before I realized he was thinner than we were. When I brought him down, I felt relief, then guilt. He would not have survived the winter either. We used everything. Meat smoked, hide stretched, bones boiled until brittle. Still, the gnawing inside my stomach never quieted fully. Nights grew colder. Frost returned thick across the ground, earlier than it should have. It coated fallen leaves in silver and turned puddles to ice before November had properly begun. One evening, Thomas Hale came again.
He looked worse than before. "They buried a child yesterday," he said. The words set between us. "Fever?" He shook his head. "Starved." I didn't know what to say. We both knew it wouldn't be the last. Rumors spread of bread riots in towns farther south, of families boiling leather, of people grinding bark into flour. I began to understand something terrifying. Hunger changes people. It narrows thought. It sharpens temper. It strips away gentleness. I felt it in myself. One morning, Sarah dropped a cup and it shattered on the floor. The sound startled me, and I snapped at her. Immediately, I regretted it. We stood in silence, both of us ashamed. This was not who we were. But hunger was shaping us into something harder, something desperate. By mid-November, snow fell. Not a light dusting, a steady, quiet blanket that settled across the fields where corn once grew. I stood at the edge of our property and looked over land that had fed my family for years. It looked lifeless, colorless, dead. For the first time, doubt crept in fully. Not doubt about survival through a season, but doubt about whether this land could ever feed us again. I thought of leaving. Ohio, Pennsylvania, anywhere the sky might be blue. But travel in winter meant risk. Travel with little food meant worse. And so we stayed. Each night, I lay awake listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. I counted what remained of our supplies in my mind. I calculated days, weeks, and for the first time since that gray morning in June, I wondered not whether we would endure hardship, but whether we would endure it all. Because hunger had taken hold, and it was not letting go.
The first true snow came before the leaves had fully surrendered. It fell in silence. Not the kind of snow that drifts lazily from a winter sky, but a steady, determined fall that began before dusk and did not stop through the night. By morning, the world outside our cabin had turned white. White in November. I stepped onto the porch and the cold cut through my coat like a blade. The air felt heavier than any winter I remembered. Not crisp, but bitter. The kind of cold that seeps in slow and stays. The fields were gone beneath it. Where corn should have stood tall in memory, there was only a flat, pale sheet. The stone wall along the boundary looked half buried already, as though the earth itself was being erased. Sarah joined me quietly. "It's too early," she whispered. I nodded, but the sky did not care for calendars. That afternoon, I split what wood remained near the cabin. Each swing of the axe felt slower than the last. Hunger had made my arms thin. My strength came in short bursts now, not steady waves. I had begun rationing labor the same way we rationed food. Firewood had once been something gathered in leisure, stacked high for comfort. Now it was life measured in cords. We counted logs the way other men counted coins. The pond froze 3 days later, not fully, but enough that ice formed along the edges thick as a man's hand. I tested it with a stick and watched cracks spider outward. The fish beneath moved sluggish, their shapes dim and distorted. I cut a hole and caught 2 more, smaller this time, thin. Everything was thinning. That evening, Thomas Hale returned. Snow clung to his boots and shoulders, his beard carried frost. He did not sit when he came in, just stood near the fire, rubbing his hands. "They're leaving in groups now," he said. "Where?" "South. Anywhere south." "With what food?" He didn't answer. We both knew the truth. People were leaving because staying meant certain decline, moving meant uncertainty, and sometimes men choose uncertainty over slow ruin. "They say the sky's clearer near Pennsylvania," he added quietly. I looked at Sarah. Her face gave nothing away, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. Hope is a dangerous thing when rations are low. That night, the wind rose. It did not howl, it pressed. It pushed against the cabin walls like something alive.
Snow drove sideways, the chimney groaned under the strain. I lay awake listening to it and understood something I had refused to admit before. This was no passing season. Whatever had broken in the world was not mending quickly. By the second week of November, our food stores had shrunk enough that I could see the bottom of barrels. Salted beef was down to strips, rye flour nearly gone, dried roots stacked like fragile kindling. We reduced again, 1 meal per day, midday, enough to quiet the shaking in our hands. I began venturing farther into the woods despite the cold. I set traps along deer paths, though tracks were scarce. Even rabbits seemed fewer than usual. One afternoon, I found a fox frozen beneath a tree. No wound, no sign of struggle, just stillness. I brought it home. We skinned it carefully, boiled the meat long to soften it. It tasted wild and sharp, but it filled our bellies for one more night. I hated the relief I felt. By late November, sickness began creeping through neighboring homes. Weakness, fever. Some said it was from bad meat. Others said it was from the ash that still faintly fell some mornings like ghostly dust. The sky never cleared, not once. The sun appeared as a pale coin behind smoke, rising and setting without warmth. Church bells rang more often. Funerals grew quieter, less ceremony, more necessity. One evening, Sarah sat at the table long after the fire had burned low. "We can't wait for spring," she said softly. The words struck me harder than the wind ever had. Spring had always been our promise: plant again, try again, begin again. But spring meant nothing if we didn't survive winter. "What are you saying?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "I'm saying we may need to leave before the snow deepens." Leave. The word felt like betrayal. My father's hands had bled into this soil. My mother was buried beyond the maple tree near the ridge. Every stone wall held memory, but memory does not feed a body. That night, I stepped outside alone. The sky glowed faintly red along the horizon, even though no sun remained. The snow reflected it back, making the world feel trapped inside a dim lantern. I stood in the silence and tried to remember what summer sunlight looked like. I struggled, and that frightened me most of all, because when a man begins to forget warmth, he begins to forget hope. Winter had arrived before its time, and we were not ready. By December, the world had narrowed to the size of our cabin. Snow lay waist-deep across the fields, drifting high against the barn doors. What little path I had carved from the house to the woodpile vanished overnight whenever the wind rose. The sky remained a dull iron gray. No sunrise, no warmth, no promise of change. The cold did not come in sharp waves anymore. It simply stayed. It lived in the walls. It crept through the cracks. It slept beside us. We had begun burning wood meant for next year. Fence posts, old tools with wooden handles, even part of the broken wagon we once planned to repair. Fire had become more valuable than food, and food was nearly gone. Our salted meat dwindled to scraps no thicker than my thumb. The rye flour barrel showed bare wood at the bottom. I scraped it carefully with a spoon, gathering every last grain. 1 meal a day had become half a meal. We chewed slowly, swallowed carefully, drank more water to trick the body into thinking it was satisfied. It did not work. Hunger became a constant ache, not sharp but deep, like something hollowing us out from within. Sarah tried to keep routine alive. She swept the floor each morning, folded blankets, mended clothes by candlelight. But her hands trembled more now. I noticed she paused often, steadying herself against the table or wall. One morning, I woke before dawn and heard her coughing, a dry, thin sound. It lingered long after she thought I'd fallen back asleep. I said nothing, but fear tightened inside me. Outside, the world had gone silent in a way I had never known. No birds, no distant wagon wheels,
no axes striking wood from neighboring farms. Several houses along the ridge stood dark now. Whether abandoned or emptied by death, I did not know. Thomas Hale had not visited in over 2 weeks. I considered walking to his place, but the snow made travel slow and dangerous. Every step sank deep. Every breath burned the lungs. Still, one afternoon I went. It took nearly an hour to cover what once required 20 minutes. When I reached his cabin, the door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the hearth was cold, the shelves bare. No bodies, no note, just absence. They had left, or fled, or wandered. I did not know which. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, staring at the emptiness. This is how it ends for some, I thought, not with noise, but with disappearance. I walked home in growing darkness. That night, the wind returned stronger than before. It rattled the shutters and drove snow hard against the roof. The chimney groaned. I fed the fire with one of the last fence rails. As flames climbed, I looked at Sarah across the room. Her face was thinner now, cheeks hollowed, eyes larger in their sockets. "We can't stay," she said quietly. There was no accusation in her voice, just truth. I wanted to argue, to insist that winter would break soon, that spring would bring warmth and we would plant again, but I no longer believed it. The sky had shown no sign of clearing, no pattern of nature remained trustworthy. Even if spring came, what then? More frost? More ash? More failure? Staying meant gambling on a broken world. Leaving meant stepping into uncertainty with almost nothing. I stared at the fire and tried to measure risk like I once measured seed and soil. "How far south?" I asked. "Far enough to find blue sky," she said. The words felt almost mythical. Blue sky. I tried to picture it and struggled. We decided that night. We would leave before the snow deepened further. We would pack what little food remained, blankets, the last of the dried meat, a kettle, matches wrapped in cloth. The wagon was gone, dismantled for firewood. So we would walk, south, toward rumor, toward hope, toward anything that did not look like this. Before sleeping, I stepped outside once more. The cold hit harder than ever, slicing through layers as though they were nothing. The sky above glowed faintly red again, even at midnight, that strange lingering stain that had haunted us since summer. The snow reflected it back, casting long shadows across the frozen field. I looked at the land my father had carved from forest. I looked at the barn standing empty. I looked at the cabin walls that had held our laughter in better years. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger on my own ground. This place had fed us once. It had sheltered us. But now it was a graveyard of crops and cattle, a monument to a season that never came. Winter had not just frozen the land, it had broken it. And in the morning, if strength allowed, we would walk away from everything we had ever known.
We left before dawn, not because it was warmer, it wasn't, but because I could not bear to watch the light touch that cabin one last time. I feared if I saw it in morning gray, I might lose my nerve. We carried everything on our backs, a sack with the last strips of salted meat, a small pouch of dried roots, 2 blankets, a kettle tied with rope, flint and steel wrapped in cloth. That was the measure of our life now. The snow reached nearly to my knees in places. Each step required effort. I broke trail ahead while Sarah followed in the path I made, her boots smaller, her breathing quieter. We did not lock the door. There was nothing left to steal. The road south, once a narrow but reliable track, had become a white corridor of silence. Fence posts jutted out like crooked teeth. Trees bowed heavy under ice. The sky remained that same dull iron color, offering no warmth even as daylight spread. We walked for hours without speaking. The body conserves energy when food is scarce. Words feel like waste. By midday, my legs trembled, not from cold alone, but weakness. Hunger had hollowed me more than I had admitted. Each rise in the land felt steeper than it should have, each breath shorter. We stopped briefly to chew a piece of dried meat no larger than 2 fingers. It tasted of salt and smoke and fear. Along the road, we began seeing others. A family of 5 pulling a crude sled piled with bedding. A man walking alone with a musket slung over his shoulder. 2 women carrying a bundle between them that did not move. No one lingered to speak long. There was a shared understanding. Conversation cost strength. But in passing, we heard fragments. Nothing left in Albany. They say Pennsylvania's worse. Snow in June, can you imagine? Rumors had grown twisted and contradictory. Every traveler carried a different story of warmth somewhere just beyond the next county. Hope had become a direction, not a certainty. By the second day, Sarah stumbled. She caught herself quickly, but I saw the truth in it. We slowed our pace. I offered to carry more weight, but she refused. "We carry it together," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. That night, we found shelter in an abandoned shed near the roadside. The roof leaked slightly where snow had forced its way between boards, but it blocked the wind. I built a small fire using splintered wood from a broken cartwheel. The flames flickered weakly, but they gave us something to stare at besides the dark. We ate the last of the roots. Only meat remained now. As we lay beneath blankets, I listened to the wind move through the cracks in the boards. It sounded different away from home, less familiar, more uncertain. On the 3rd morning, we saw smoke in the distance, not from a home, but from a field. As we approached, we found a group of travelers burning furniture, chairs, table legs, anything wooden. They had formed a circle in the snow, guarding a pot suspended over flames. Inside, something boiled thin and gray. A man with hollow cheeks looked up as we approached. "Rabbit broth," he said, though there was no rabbit in sight. He offered us a cup. I hesitated only a moment before accepting. It tasted mostly of water and ash, but it warmed the throat. We traded a strip of meat for a small sack of dried corn they had managed to keep. Trade had become survival's language. By afternoon, the sky darkened again, though it was not yet evening. Snow began falling, thick, heavy flakes that erased tracks within minutes. Panic stirred quietly in my chest. Losing the road meant wandering. Wandering meant death. We pressed forward despite fatigue. By dusk, Sarah's steps had grown uneven. I could hear strain in her breathing. "We'll stop soon," I told her. She nodded but did not answer. We found a grove of pines dense enough to block the worst of the wind. I cleared snow with numb hands and built a fire beneath the trees. It took longer than it should have. My fingers no longer moved with certainty. When the flames finally caught, relief nearly buckled my knees. We shared one more strip of meat, just one. I calculated what remained. 2 days, perhaps 3 if divided carefully. The snow fell harder through the night. At some point, I woke to silence so complete it startled me. The wind had stopped. The world felt buried. I looked at Sarah beside me. Her eyes were open. "Do you think the sky will ever turn blue again?" she asked softly. I wanted to answer with certainty, with conviction, but I had seen too much gray. "I believe it will," I said, and for the first time since June, I wasn't entirely sure I was telling the truth. We had left home seeking warmth, but the farther we walked, the more it seemed the cold was following us, and hunger walked at our side. By the fourth day on the road, I understood something with a clarity that frightened me. We were not walking toward hope. We were walking against time. The snow had swallowed the road entirely by morning. What had once been wagon ruts and packed earth was now a smooth, endless white stretch, broken only by tree lines and distant fences half buried beneath drifts. Without visible markers, direction became guesswork. I relied on memory, on the slope of land, on the faint pull of instinct that said south lay somewhere ahead. But instinct weakens when the body weakens. We ate the last strip of salted meat that morning. I divided it carefully. Sarah tried to give half of hers back. I refused. There would be no heroics between us, only survival. By midday, the wind rose again, not violent, but steady enough to drive snow sideways across our faces. It stung the eyes and crusted along the edges of our scarves. I noticed Sarah lagging farther behind. Her steps were no longer steady. They dragged. Each foot seemed to search for strength that wasn't there. "We'll rest," I said. She shook her head. "If we stop too long, we won't start again." She was right. Rest had become dangerous. The body, once still, resisted motion like a stubborn door frozen shut. So we kept moving. We passed another group near a frozen stream, 3 men and a boy. They had built a crude shelter from branches and canvas. One of the men called out, "Road's worse ahead." "How far to the next town?" I asked. He stared at me for a long moment before answering. "If it's still there." Those words followed us long after we left them behind. By afternoon, clouds thickened overhead, turning the dim light almost metallic. The sun, if it existed at all, was nothing more than a pale suggestion behind the haze. The cold felt different that day. Not sharper, but deeper. It moved through layers and settled beneath skin, into bone. Sarah stumbled again, harder this time. She fell to one knee. I dropped my pack immediately. She tried to stand. Her legs trembled violently. "I'm fine," she whispered, but she wasn't. Her face had taken on a grayness I had seen once before, in Bess, the cow, the day before she could not rise. Fear gripped me, not loud, not frantic, but cold and certain. I pulled her toward a cluster of trees and cleared snow with frantic hands. I gathered broken branches, snapped twigs, anything that would burn. My fingers barely obeyed me. When the fire finally caught, it felt like a fragile miracle. I wrapped both blankets around her. Her breathing was shallow, too shallow. "We should have left sooner," she murmured. "No," I said quickly, "we'll reach town tomorrow." But the truth hovered unspoken. We had no food, little strength, and no guarantee of shelter ahead. The wind quieted toward evening, leaving a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that exists in graveyards. I stepped away from the fire briefly to scan the horizon. The world looked endless and empty. No smoke, no rooftops, no sign of life. For the first time since we left the cabin, doubt overwhelmed me fully. What if the cold stretched farther south than we believed? What if there was no blue sky waiting? What if the sky had turned against the whole world? When I returned to the fire, Sarah's eyes were closed. Panic surged through me. I knelt beside her and shook her gently. Her eyes opened after a long moment, but slowly, too slowly. "You must stay awake," I said. She nodded faintly. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped even further. The fire shrank to embers faster than I could feed it. Wood was scarce here. Most branches were buried or frozen solid. I faced a choice no man wishes to make: stay through the night and risk the cold claiming her, or move in darkness and risk losing the road entirely. I listened to her breathing, counted it, measured it against the wind. Then I did something I had not done since childhood. I prayed, not loudly, not with ceremony, just a simple plea whispered into the frozen dark. Give us one more day, just one.
Sometime in the deep of night, snow began falling again, soft at first, then steady. I rose repeatedly to shake it from the blankets before it buried us. Each time my limbs felt heavier, my thoughts slower. The cold was not just outside now, it had begun to live inside us. When dawn finally came, if that dim gray glow could be called dawn, I looked at Sarah. Her lips were pale, her eyes distant, and I understood the truth in a way that left no room for denial. If we did not find shelter today, we would not find it at all. This was the breaking point, not of land, not of season, but of us, and the sky above remained silent.
Morning did not bring warmth. It brought decision. Sarah could not walk far, that much was clear. Her legs trembled beneath her like saplings in wind, and her breath came thin and uneven. The fire had died to ash sometime before dawn, and the cold had crept into everything. Blankets, boots, bone. I lifted our packs without speaking. Then I helped her stand. "We move slow," I said, "but we move." She nodded. There was no strength left for debate. The snow had softened overnight, falling thick and heavy. Our tracks from the day before were gone entirely, erased as though we had never passed. That unsettled me more than I expected. It felt like the world was swallowing evidence of survival. We walked, not with purpose, but with necessity. Each step felt mechanical. Lift, plant, pull. Lift, plant, pull. Hours blurred together in a haze of white and gray. The sky remained colorless. The land offered no comfort. My thoughts narrowed to one singular need: find shelter. Near midday, though it was hard to judge time beneath that dim veil, I saw something ahead, a line that did not belong to forest or fence, a shape, dark against the snow. At first I thought it a trick of light, but as we drew closer, edges sharpened. A roof line, then another, a church steeple rising crooked into the dull sky. A town. Relief surged so sudden it nearly buckled my knees. "We made it," I said, more to myself than to Sarah. But as we approached, that relief shifted. No smoke rose from chimneys. No sound drifted through the air. No dogs barked. No wheels turned. The town sat still, too still. We entered along the main road, snow piled high against storefronts. Windows were dark. One door swung gently in the wind, creaking in slow rhythm. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded foreign in the silence. No answer. We moved cautiously past the general store. The sign above it hung crooked, one chain snapped. Snow had drifted halfway up the front steps. Inside, through the frosted glass, shelves stood nearly empty. I pushed the door open. It groaned in protest. The air inside was stale, cold as outside. Barrels lay overturned. A single sack of flour sat torn open on the floor, its contents long gone or spoiled. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just abandonment. We checked house after house. Most were empty. Beds stripped, cupboards bare. Some looked as though families had left in haste. Chairs knocked sideways, a child's toy abandoned in snow near a doorway. In one home, we found a hearth still laid with ash from what must have been the last fire burned weeks ago. Whatever had happened here, it had not happened suddenly. It had happened slowly, like everywhere else. At the church, the door was barred from inside. I hesitated before pushing. It opened with effort. The air within felt heavier, colder. 3 pews had been dragged near the altar, forming a makeshift sleeping area. Blankets lay crumpled where people once huddled together. Near the front, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A small mound near the far wall, covered carefully. I did not approach it. I did not need to. This town had not escaped what followed us. It had surrendered to it.
Sarah sank onto a pew. "We were too late," she whispered. I knelt beside her. The realization settled heavy in my chest. We had walked days toward refuge that no longer existed. But then I noticed something else. Behind the church, near the edge of town, smoke. Faint, thin, but rising. I stood immediately. "Stay here," I said. She shook her head weakly. "No." So we went together. Beyond the last row of homes, near what must have once been a mill house, a small fire burned behind a low stone wall. 2 figures crouched beside it, an older man and a young girl. They looked up sharply as we approached, hands tightened around a hatchet. "We mean no harm," I said quickly. The man studied us long before nodding slightly. "You're late," he said. "Late for what?" "For leaving." His voice carried no bitterness, only fatigue. He told us most had fled weeks earlier when food vanished completely. Some headed south, some west, a few stayed. "Didn't matter," he said. "Cold came anyway." They had survived by trapping what little wildlife remained and rationing what dried goods they could salvage from abandoned homes. "Sky's clearing some days," the girl added quietly. I looked up instinctively. The clouds still hung thick, but perhaps somewhere beyond that gray veil, something was shifting. The man gestured toward a small shed behind the mill house. "You can shelter there tonight." It was not much, but it was walls. It was cover. It was fire shared between strangers bound by the same disaster. That night, as flames flickered against the stone and the wind eased for the first time in days, I felt something fragile stir inside me. Not relief, not yet, but possibility. We had not found salvation, we had found survival. And sometimes, that is enough for one more day.
The first morning in the ghost town felt different. Not warmer, but different. I woke before the others, the cold air biting at my face as I stepped outside the shed. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving behind a bed of glowing embers beneath ash. I stirred them gently and added a splinter of wood, watching the flame take hold. And then I noticed it. Light. Not the usual dull gray that had haunted us for months, but something thinner, something less oppressive. The clouds overhead looked fractured, as if the sky itself had begun to crack. I stepped away from the shed, boots crunching softly in fresh snow, and looked east. For the first time since June, I saw something close to color, a faint blue seam near the horizon. It was small, almost fragile, but it was there. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there longer than I meant to, afraid it might vanish if I blinked. Behind me, Sarah stepped outside, wrapping her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What is it?" she asked quietly. I pointed. She followed my gaze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The older man emerged from the mill house soon after. He squinted at the horizon and let out a slow breath. "Been seeing that more often," he said, "last few days." The words felt unreal. More often. As the morning wore on, the blue widened slightly. The gray veil still hung thick across most of the sky, but light pierced through in thin ribbons. The sun, for the first time in months, did not look like a dying ember. It looked almost alive. Almost. We spent that day gathering what we could from the town. The older man showed me a small cache of dried beans he had hidden beneath loose floorboards in the store. Not much, but enough for several days if divided carefully. I helped reinforce the shed walls with boards pulled from abandoned homes. We worked slowly, our strength still fragile, but the labor felt different now. Purpose had returned. Hope, thin and cautious, had crept back in. By afternoon, the temperature rose slightly, not enough to melt snow, but enough that I no longer saw my breath constantly in the air. The girl laughed once, a small, unexpected sound, when a patch of ice cracked loudly near the stream. It startled all of us, but it was laughter. That night, the sky cleared further. Stars. I had forgotten stars. For months, the heavens had been a ceiling of ash and smoke. Now, pinpricks of light pierced through darkness like old friends returning. Sarah stood beside me, her hand slipping into mine. "I'd forgotten how they looked," she whispered. So had I. The cold remained, the land remained buried, but something fundamental had shifted. The sky was healing. Over the next days, we watched it happen gradually. Blue expanded, sunlight brightened, the red-stained sunsets faded into something more natural, softer gold instead of bruised crimson. The older man believed the worst had passed. "Whatever poisoned the air," he said, "it's thinning." We did not know then of Mount Tambora, of the eruption that had hurled ash high into the stratosphere the year before, of how that ash had circled the globe, choking light and lowering temperatures across continents. All we knew was that the sky, which had turned against us, was finally retreating. Food was still scarce, winter still gripped the land, but survival no longer felt impossible. One afternoon, I stood near the edge of town and looked south again. For the first time, I did not feel the urge to keep walking. We had chased blue sky and found it here, not in warmth, not in abundance, but in the smallest sign that the world still turned as it should. Sarah had grown slightly stronger with shared meals and rest. Color returned faintly to her cheeks, and in the quiet that followed months of despair, I felt something I had not felt since early spring, the possibility of planting again. Not soon, not yet, but someday. The land would need time to recover, so would we. But the sky, the great ceiling of our lives, was no longer pressing down on us. It was opening, and in that opening, I saw not certainty, but chance. After months of darkness, chance was enough.
Spring should have followed winter. It always had. Every year before 1816, the thaw came on time. Rivers ran warm, buds pushed through frozen soil, and the fields breathed life once more. But that spring did not come as expected, not in the way we had known, not in the way we had trusted. We survived. Somehow we survived. Sarah and I, the older man, the girl, we made it through snow-choked fields, frozen streams, and endless gray skies. The road south, once an uncertain path, had brought us to this small town of abandoned homes and fragile shelter. And here, under skies that finally allowed color to return, we began to piece together the world that had been shattered. But survival came at a cost. I had counted every bite of food for months, measured every step in snow, and watched friends and neighbors disappear into silence. Livestock lost, crops dead, families scattered or claimed by hunger and cold. I had held Sarah in my arms as her body weakened under exhaustion. I had buried animals that once fed us, buried them with the understanding that life was fragile and survival cruel. And yet, despite all that loss, despite the gnawing hunger and the endless frost, the sky changed. Slowly, it cleared. The light returned. Sunlight filtered through the thawing air, fragile and pale at first, then brighter each day. Blue, unmistakable blue stretched above the snow, washing the landscape in clarity. It was a reminder that the world still moved forward, that the natural order, though broken temporarily, was not destroyed. We began to gather what we could. Barrels of beans hidden beneath floorboards, sacks of grain overlooked in abandoned homes, a few stores of dried meat or corn. Every scrap was precious, every meal carefully shared. And though it was barely enough to sustain us, it meant we could finally plan.
Not yet planting crops, not yet rebuilding barns or fences, but planning for tomorrow, for spring, for hope. The people we met, the man and the girl who had survived alongside us, became family in ways that blood could not define. We shared warmth, fire, food, and stories of the months past.
There was laughter again, though careful and rare, fragile as ice on a thawing pond. And in those moments, I realized how deeply hunger and fear reshape a person. How quickly survival strips away pretense, leaving only raw, honest necessity. I returned one day to the edge of the fields where our home had been. Covered in snow and frost, the cabin and barns were barely visible. The stone walls I had built with my father were half buried. Bess, Martha, the heifer, the animals that had sustained life on the farm, were gone, their absence a silent testament to the merciless months past. I knelt in the snow, tracing a finger along the frozen earth, and whispered a promise that when the sun shone fully again, we would honor what was lost by surviving, by planting, by living. By summer, the temperature had begun to normalize. Crops were slow to grow. Many fields stripped of topsoil by frost and ash were barren, but we planted anyway. One row of beans, one patch of potatoes, a few corn shoots tucked carefully into thawing earth. Each seed placed by hand felt like defiance against the cold, against hunger, against the gray sky that had nearly claimed us all. That year became known as the year without a summer. Across Vermont, New England, and much of the northern hemisphere, families endured frost in June, snow in July, and famine that touched nearly every home. But it was not just a story of loss, it was a story of endurance, of human determination, of a world forced to pause, reflect, and survive in ways no one had expected. I tell this story now not as a tale of despair, but as a reminder that life bends but does not always break, that the sun, even when hidden by ash and frost, will return, that the land, even when scarred and emptied, can grow again, and that survival is measured not only by days lived, but by the courage to move forward when the world has turned against you. Sarah and I still talk about those months, about the gray skies, the frost, the hunger, the long walks through snow, about the people who vanished and the strangers who became family. And when we look at the fields now, when green finally returns, we remember. The day the sky turned black, the crops died, and the world seemed to hold its breath. We survived, and in surviving, we found the strength to start again.